It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? It's a neighborly day in the beauty wood, a neighborly day for a beauty. Could you be mine? You must see Won't You Be My Neighbor documentary, please. That's a little commercial at the beginning, see. I can do that, and then I'll get into the main program. I knew Fred Rogers fairly well, a fabulous guy, and a very interesting person, interested in people behaving civilly and warmly toward each other. And I'll just say that's a subpart of my message. Because one of the things I want you to do today is to learn a little bit more about Milton Friedman as a person, as well as his ideas. I'm going to start out, though, by sharing a poem with you. And I want you to think about the relationship between free market capitalism and the arts. I once held on my knees a simple wooden box in which a rainbow lay dusty and broken. It was a set of pastels that years before belonged to the painter Mary Cassatt. And all the colors she'd used in her work lay open before me. Those hues she'd most used, the peaches and pinks, were worn down to the stubs, while the cool colors, violet, ultramarine, had been set, scarcely touched, to one side. She'd had little patience with darkness, and her heart held only a measure of shadow. I touched the warm dust of those colors, her tools, and left there with light on the tips of my fingers. Wow. You know, there's this saying, a picture's worth 1,000 words. We're going to be talking about quotes today. We're going to be talking about words. And I think that that's wrong. I think a word can be a million pictures. Think of a single, I'm going to give you a single word. Well, first of all, try to imagine me visually projecting to you the sense that you get from that poem, the sense of the creative process, even a little bit of sense of who Mary Cassatt might have been like. And could I really have done that with pictures? Maybe, but it would have been tricky. But I want to give you one word as my primary evidence that we ought to turn that around. Mom. Think of the millions and millions of impressions and emotions and meanings connected to that one word. And for me, as a again, as a video person, to try to take on the challenge of conveying as much to you about Mom with video rather than just giving you that word. And what does it do? It is just tearing through your mind. It is rushing through your mind. The images are essentially limitless, particularly when it involves even a group this size, all the experiences you've had, etc. So, as we think about Milton Friedman, and I'm going to share with you some of his words, I'm interested in impact of ideas. And that means people being open to thinking about them and accepting them. And the words that one uses are very critical in getting that to happen. That you think of me, by the way, as a nice person, and you notice the tie I have on. And I started wearing Winnie the Pooh ties when my wife and I were raising a granddaughter, but then I realized something. Everywhere I'd go, people would say, I like your tie. That's a great tie. Wow. And then we'd talk about maybe Winnie the Pooh. What was that doing? That was saying to the other people, we have some common values. here's a person, my gosh, if you like Winnie the Pooh, that has something to say about who you are and what you mean and what you value. Shut up. I turned it into airplane mode. I don't know how it's doing that, but I don't know technology. So in any case, I want to share with you, as I said, some of Milton Friedman's quotes, but I also want to give you a sense of who Milton Friedman was. And one of the wonders of my life, I've had one of the most successful lives I can imagine of anybody in terms of its richness. Not its wealth, its richness. And as evidence of that, I brought along a good friend of mine to introduce you to Milton Friedman.
Thank you.
George Shultz, Secretary of State.
Milton, friends of Rose and Milton. I have spoken around the world quite a bit, and I frequently get asked in the Q&A part of that. People will say, well, you've dealt with presidents and prime ministers and kings and so on over a long period of time, and who has made the greatest difference? And so I ruminate about Gorbachev and one person or another, and of course in the end come around to Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, and I get through talking about them, and I say, well, all things considered, I have to say Milton Friedman. And I think you all know, and you could give the reasons why you would say, all things considered, when it comes to really making a difference, it would be Milton. And I suspect that Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher might give you the same answer, because they have been powerfully influenced by his ideas. And thank you for all of the other things you've done. I have one final comment, and this is lightly methodological. Now, we know Milton's prowess as an intellect, as a theorist, but we also know, and has been brought out by earlier comments, how insistent he is that if you have a theory, you better test it with facts. And a theory that can't be tested better be reformulated so it can be tested. And you've got to bring the facts together. So I know, Milton, you're tone deaf, but it isn't going to bother you. I'm going to sing, but you won't know. So here's my song, my methodological tribute. A fact without a theory is like a ship without a sail, is like a boat without a rudder, is like a kite without a tail. A fact without a theory is as sad can be. But if there's one thing worse in this universe, it's a theory. I said a theory. I mean a theory without a fact. So, Milton and Rose, you have given us recently a wonderful book, Two Lucky People. But I'm here to tell you that we are the lucky people who benefited so much from your influence and your ideas and your friendship. Thank you.
Yeah, George loves to sing. My staff arranged for him to sing Happy Birthday to me on my 80th birthday. But I had to respond in kind, so on his 97th birthday, I recorded the Princeton fight song and sent it to him as a happy birthday greeting. The reason why I wanted you to see that is a number of reasons. One, that someone who has the background and experience of George Shultz, which is, I don't think there's ever been a person that held as many cabinet positions successfully as George Shultz. Enormously effective and successful person, and who assesses Milton Friedman's importance in that way. But it's the content of what he said that I want you to think about. Because Milton Friedman, he was an ideologue in the good sense. The word ideologue is much maligned, and it's tended to become used now to suggest somebody who's out to advance ideas without regard to truth. Milton was interested in ideas, and he was interested in finding truth. He was not interested in finding facts that would support his belief as to what was true. And so much today of the debate that goes on is not that. So much of the debate today and so much of the facts that are presented are selectively chosen by the individual to support whatever position they fundamentally agree with. Milton once explained to me why he was uncomfortable with von Mises. Those of you who are studying economics, Ludwig von Mises. And his position was, von Mises's approach was to sit in a room, think things through, and come to a conclusion as to what was the answer. And once he had done that, that's it. That is the answer. And you don't question it. And Milton said, I just can't accept that approach. In other words, von Mises was theorizing, and he was unwilling to subject those theories to tests. Milton was just the reverse. And that's important because, again, in today's climate, there's a real tendency to select those facts that are going to support your position, and therefore not to take the time necessarily to even understand the other position. And all of us are busy, so sometimes that's difficult to do, but you should make your best effort. So that's what gives you a sense of Milton as an intellect, as a scholar, and what you might aspire to. Now, Milton and Rose as just plain ordinary people. And I could give you a number of examples, but the one I love best, again, is around Milton's 90th birthday. I began running about a year, 2 years, I started with Milton in 1977, and I think I started doing my running about that same time. I had always been fairly active, but I hadn't been seriously involved in fitness until then. But by the time Milton's 90th birthday, he was fully aware of the fact that I was what you might call a fitness nut. And so I went to visit him. I'd go to his apartment, and he and Rose and I would chat for a while, and then we'd go to dinner with some other people I'd invited who were very anxious to meet Milton. But I was there, and I show up at the door, and Milton said, Bob, how many miles did you run today? And I said, Milton, I didn't run any miles today, but I did do 250 stomach crunches. What's a stomach crunch? That's what he asked me. Now, again, in this case, words weren't going to suffice. I get down on the rug in his apartment, and I do a couple stomach crunches, and I'm doing it kind of, my hands up here, and I kind of like this, and I put my hands down. Milton's right here, lying on his back next to me, 90 years old, doing these little tiny stomach crunches, and Rose gets down on this side and does the same thing. Milton Friedman was a person of huge curiosity. He would be frustrated if he came into this room and did not have time to sit and learn a lot about each and every one of you. Why? Because he loved people. He changed from he wanted to be an actuarial scientist or whatever. He studied math at Rutgers, and he watched the Great Depression, and he said, something's wrong here. There are empty factories all over the place here. And then I look over here, and there are lines of people who would like to have work. Why isn't that coming together? And he switched, and Arthur Burns was at Rutgers, and Arthur helped persuade him to go into economics, and he went to the University of Chicago after he graduated from Rutgers and started his master's degree at Chicago. Now, for me, there's an important link to me there, because when he went to Chicago, there were two other people, actually three, Rose Friedman went there at the same time to do a master's degree, and she ended up sitting next to him in a course that sat people by last names, because her last name was Director. And they eventually then got married. But also, at the University of Chicago at that time, were George Stigler, a future Nobel laureate, along with Milton, and a fellow by the name of Alan Wallace. And the three of them, Milton described as the Three Musketeers. That's what he called them until they all were dead. And Alan Wallace and I got to know each other, and through him I got to meet Milton Friedman. So it was an interesting kind of circle there. But that gives you a little bit of sense of who Milton Friedman was. But there's one other thing. I grew up in a family where political debate was shouting at each other at dinner tables. And in fact, I was well along in, around when I met Milton, that I began to understand that you could have debates or discussions, which he preferred to call them, and which I like the phrase discussion better than debate, without being disagreeable, without being nasty, and really giving some attention to what the other person had to say. So later in my association with Milton, I asked him, I said, Milton, is that you? Is that your given, DNA given personality? And he said, oh, no, Bob. And he told me the story, and it's on a video that you can watch at freetochoose.tv. There's a lot of things there, so you may have to look a bit to find it. But he answers that question to me on camera, and he explains how he was working in Washington, D.C., and he is appointed to a committee to work on an issue. And he didn't mention the issue because it's immaterial. And one of the people who was a member of that committee was a woman economist in the agricultural department. And at one of their meetings, Milton put her down in the most aggressive, probably not very pleasant way, telling her she didn't know what she was talking about, etc. And he said, Bob, about 2 weeks later, after more thought, I realized she was right. And I said to myself at that point in time, I will never again do that to anyone. And then he turned to Rose on the video and he says, and I think I've been pretty good at that, right? And she agreed. And I certainly will tell you, I agree. I never witnessed him expressing anger, certainly express conviction, certainly express determination, but never anger, even when, on 2 occasions, I'll give you 2 examples. The Nobel Prize, Milton's name was announced, and a young man, because there's all kinds of protests of Milton about him going to Chile at the time, and a young man got up and screamed from the balcony. And we have a shot of Milton standing there in his tails, getting his Nobel Prize. And I think if you watch it, if you have a chance to see it, here's what you'll note. You'll note, first of all, when that happens, Milton will become, his face will become very stone, very hard, very anger. There's anger in that face, and then you will watch it melt away. It just comes away, and he just relaxes. I also attended a lecture he did at Cornell, and a student got up in the Q&A and accused him of being a Nazi. And you can just imagine, you think it through, all the implications of that with Milton. And again, he just let it flow by, and he tried to deal with the specific issues that were involved. So I want to start off with a quote of Milton's that, in a certain sense, if I can run this technology, which Russ is very good at, and he gave me a tutorial, so I'm able to manage. And I'll read the quote to you. The ideal is unanimity among responsible individuals achieved on the basis of free and full discussion. From this standpoint, the role of the market, as already noted, is that it permits unanimity without conformity. Unanimity without conformity. That it is a system of effectively proportional representation. I'm obviously fairly intense about ideas, about these ideas. It's only been in the last 4 or 5 years I've even been willing to think about the word compromise. But as I've thought about it, I've come to understand how profoundly important that word is. And I'll just give you an easy thing to think about. Conceive of a way in which a free society can exist without compromise. Any of you want to try to write a paper on that? Yeah, I think it would be an interesting exploration. My own conclusion is there is no way. Because what are you trying to achieve in a free society? You're trying to achieve self-government. But you're trying to achieve self-government on a macro level. But in order to do that, there has to be self-government on the micro level. And how many micros are there here? 40, so something like that. So how long do you think it's going to take us to compromise on the fact that tomorrow all of us have to engage in one recreational activity? We have to, as a group, all of us do the same thing. How long do you think it will take us to come to some consensus or compromise as to what that would be? And then just think about, in a nation of 300 plus million people, in some ways you could say it's a miracle we are doing as well as we are. But if we don't, going forward from this moment on, go back to understanding the critical aspect of compromise in our structure, this nation is I don't know what's going to happen, but I know it's not going to be good, because we will have lost touch with that critical sense that the founders had. Now, apply the same thing, by the way. People tend to think of markets in the context of finance, selling, and whatever. Markets is everything. Economics and markets are about choice. It's about choosing. I asked these two young men, did they come here voluntarily, or were they kind of coerced into coming here through extra credit or something? And they said, oh, they came voluntarily. Now, they knew that was the answer I was hoping they'd give me. But it was an exercise of choice on their part. And that's all economics is about. I'm sorry, forgive me, professors, but that's all it's about. It's about thinking about your own choices, constantly evaluating them in terms of the many choices you're presented with. And economics wants to figure out, well, what's going on there? What's the likelihood you'll choose this as opposed to that? That's what economics is doing. And it's doing it in higher and higher levels, but it's also down to, as Gary Becker, who undertook to work let's see, his second position was sociology, right? Not psychology. Gary Becker. I think it was one or the other. But for example, he did an entire bit of work on choosing your husband or wife. And that's part of the economic way of thinking, of analyzing choices, determining what the likely outcome is. Predicting the outcome is ultimately what you'd like to do, because if you're going, that's why the CME group exists, so you can hedge your bets when you make financial choices. So you have compromise. You have compromise on ideas and beliefs. You have compromise on wants and needs. And that will vary at stages in life and with who you are. Those things that you feel are absolutely essential to your happiness, and those things that will maybe make you a little happy, but you don't absolutely need them, and the survival things. And then desires and tastes. And the market allows us not to have to conform. And that means in the market, you have the least amount of compromise. So in the political side of our lives, compromise is absolutely essential and core. But I do not have to compromise on the toothpaste I use. I do not have to compromise on the car I drive. Those are very important points to keep in mind. Now I want to share with you a quote from Eric Hoffer and recommend that he's someone in the history of ideas that is a very, very interesting place. He was a longshoreman at one point. He was also, though, primarily an itinerant laborer in the farm fields of the Central Valley of California. He's written 2 or 3 books, essentially in philosophy and human behavior. And he would work picking peas and picking tomatoes for 6-8 months to build up enough of a reserve in his savings account to rent himself a hotel room in, I think it was Oakland, I'm not sure, but somewhere in that Bay Area where he was close to the public library. And for 6 months he would then engage in a self-study activity. Fascinating fellow. I talked to him once by phone, and the only way I could reach him, because he lived on a very, very modest budget, didn't have a phone, but a fellow who was writing a story about him arranged the call, and he said, you can call Eric at this number at this time, and be sure you call at that time, because this is a payphone, and Eric will stand there and answer the payphone. It's kind of like a mystery movie. I wanted Eric Hoffer to participate in a video discussion with Milton Friedman. He turned me down because he said, I don't think Friedman and I will have much in common. He was so wrong. And I regret that I was never able to persuade him to do that. But here's Eric's observation about words. We're going back to words again. We know that words cannot move mountains, but they can move the multitude. And men are more ready to fight and die for a word than for anything else. Words shape thought, stir feeling, and beget action. They kill and revive, corrupt and cure. The men of words, priests, prophets, intellectuals, have played a more decisive role in history than military leaders, statesmen, and businessmen. So what did Milton Friedman offer in the way of words? So let's move into the specific series of quotes I'd like to share with you. And obviously there are many, many choices. In organizing them, I thought to tie them to 4 questions, that 3 of which I think many of you have heard already somewhere. And the 4th I kind of added to the 3. Who chooses, who benefits, who pays, and what's fair? And the first Friedman quote I want you to consider is the following. This is very relevant to what's happened in politics in the last year and a half. I'm in favor of cutting taxes under any circumstances and for any reason, any excuse for any reason, whenever it's possible. So, when the tax reform bill came forward, there were a lot of arguments that said, oh my heavens, the Republicans have lost their way, etc., because they're willing to let the deficit rise, in which they were always using it as a political tool to get elected. Well, right. And that just shows you that politicians do not have a very firm foundation they stand on. That's a given. Milton Friedman would say, reduce the taxes. And he would have a couple reasons at least for doing that. One, by reducing the taxes, you're spending more of your money. You are at least reducing, his thought was and hope, that would reduce government's ability to do things. Of course, what happens is government now borrows and borrows and borrows. And his answer there would be, you still hold the course, because eventually the borrowing is going to come to roost. It's not going to be pleasant, but there's nothing you can do seemingly to stop it. By the way, let me give you I assume all of you are aware the government doesn't have any money. My granddaughter that Carol and I raised, she had to put up with me mentoring her for many years. And in 8th grade in the Catholic church or school she went to, she came home one day and said, Grandpa, yeah, we were talking about health care, and the nun said, yeah, government ought to provide health care for everybody, And I asked her, well, where's the government going to get the money? And the nun says, well, the government has money. And Beth says, well, no, they don't, not unless they take it from somebody. So the very concept that we live on it's very easy to do that. And it's like saying, well, I'm going to touch on that later. I get passionate about this. But understanding that politicians have a goal. They have a goal, which is to have a job. Politicians are really selling a product. And the product is their help to you. Now, I would add editorially, their professed help to you. But that's what they're selling. And Tom Sowell, another name, Eric Hoffer is one that I hope you poke around and read something of his. But Tom Sowell, I'd say as an economist, or even if you're not an economist, you really, really need to read some of his work. It's profoundly interesting and easy to read. And he describes the political process as well as anybody I've ever heard. The fundamental problem is that politicians like to give away things to voters, and the government doesn't produce anything to give. But the politicians can rob Peter to pay Paul, but this will lose them a vote every time they gain one. The trick is to rob Peter to pay Paul and rob Paul to pay Peter and get both their votes. And that really is a clear description of the governmental process as we see it today. Economists, well, let's put it this way. You know, in the economic world, you and I vote frequently every day. And as I mentioned with toothpaste, we get what we want. Hardly ever are we disappointed. And if we are, in the market, you hardly ever have a problem getting a remedy in a hurry. You either stop dealing with that particular store or you even get the product exchange, etc. We should all try to trade in our politician. Let's see if we can trade in our congressman who promised us gazillion things and hardly ever delivers on anything that they promise. That's the difference between economics and the free market and politics and command economy. Another thing I want you to be sure you understand, I mentioned it earlier, I'm going to reinforce it. Economics choosing isn't about finance solely, it's about everything. It's your major source of happiness. The one thing that I can take away from you, the one thing the government has the power to take away from you, is your freedom. And I think that is the result. That's what gives you the greatest degree of happiness. The fact that you woke up one morning, you had an idea of something you wanted to do that day, and there was nothing impeding you from trying to do that. And I like to say that government, they can take away your life, they can take away your livelihood. And I want them to be very, very tiny as a result of that. Okay, now to another Friedman quote that's the other side of the coin of what I just shared with you. The widespread enthusiasm for reducing government taxes and other impositions is not matched by a comparable enthusiasm for eliminating government programs, except programs that benefit other people. That I am happy to take away a program that benefits Griffin. But I don't want anybody to take away the program that benefits me. And again, I won't belabor that. I hope all of you are sharp kids. We know that because we've taken taken Arkansas kids to Dartmouth, which is ranked as one of those top intellectual schools. And boy, I got the wrong quote. Yeah, I did. That's because somehow I'm not used to working this thing. Sorry. Thank you, Russ. And we had a session with Dartmouth and Arkansas students together, and the Arkansas students went away afterwards and said, "My, they're not that smart. They're not that much sharper than we are." And I can attest to that. But think of what I just said. We have a problem. Milton Friedman repeatedly said, if you want to know the problem of why we have a huge government, go home and look in the mirror. And without question, if we took the time to go through, I'd say, half a dozen maybe would do it, dozen certainly would, that with a dozen different programs of government, we would find people in this room who say, oh, no, no, we can't get rid of that. That's really something that I got to have. And I won't try to go through you can make up your own examples of that. But the problem is, again, there's also, it's almost a sense here that we have to grab things, because, and I've heard people say, well, claim your Social Security because you paid into it all your life, even though the fact is that I've already had a return that's, well, I don't know what it is, tenfold over to what I paid into it. And where's that money come from? How many of you are employed? How many of you are already paying into Social Security? I want to thank you very much for your help. But I would want to do away with that program tomorrow, but not necessarily do away with mandatory retirement somehow. I'm not sure about that one. If there was going to be anything like Social Security, I would be in favor of a program where you were required to set aside 3%, 4%, 5% of your income, but that money would go into various investment accounts, et cetera, which you would control so that you would have a control over it. And by the way, the evidence is that you'd be far better off at your retirement than with Social Security. All right, now we get to one other aspect of it. But by the way, that does bring up the second of my points, who chooses, who benefits, because in this case, again, you're benefiting from the action of government, but in doing so, you're accepting the fact that in a way, you have voted to legalize theft. And you're giving government the role, you're giving government the right to do something that you as an individual could not do. You could not go to your neighbor and say, you've got to give me $50 a month in order to help me live. But the government can do that. So we're again in a very difficult political science, philosophical situation in a free society. And it's not easy. And there are no easy answers. And I hope all of you continue to explore them and find answers that we were not able to find in our efforts. All right. Now, also there's the argument again that the market does a better job of allocating benefits than government does. But now let me turn to one of what I think is, well, let's put it this way. How many of you know of John Mackey? Do you know that name? Ah, nobody. You do. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And Ken, you know of John Mackey?
Go ahead.
Okay. How many of you shop at Whole Foods?
There you go.
There you go. John Mackey started Whole Foods. And John Mackey left college, like many of these people that were hugely successful, but first he went to a communal farm. And at the communal farm, he learned very directly the lesson of the free rider. And it changed him to be a libertarian. Free rider, by the way. In other words, that there were 20 people on the communal farm, and as in many cases, 8 of the people did all the work, and the other 12 lived off of the other 8. And John quickly got the sense that that was not the kind of world he wanted to live in, and yet he was still, if you would, into organic foods, etc. So he started an organic food store, and it grew to be the huge success that it is today, and then Amazon just bought it. And I love it because I do shop at Whole Foods, and now I can get a discount because I'm a Prime Amazon member. But the point is that Milton made this statement, and then I'll explain to you the interaction with John Mackey. Few trends could so thoroughly undermine the very foundations of our free society as the acceptance by corporate officials of a social responsibility other than to make as much money for their stockholders as possible. Milton Friedman, boy, that was a rallying cry against many, many people have fought against that. And I introduced John Mackey to Milton at a dinner, and John came up to me right before we sat down, and he said, Bob, you know this quote of Milton's, got to remember to switch it. This quote of Milton's is, I just don't agree with it totally. And I'm going to argue it. I said, hey, be my guest, be my guest. Anybody who wanted to argue with Milton, I was delighted to sit there and watch the entertainment. So they had quite a discussion. And John's argument was, and he started a group, by the way, which I think is worth you looking at. And in fact, Matt, that's somebody that you and I should work to get John to campus to talk about it. And he started this way of looking at business called conscious capitalism. Now at the dinner, at the end of our dinner, we drove back to the Friedman's apartment, and Milton said to me, well, Bob, he said, John's a very sharp guy, I really like him, but I think I would describe what he's saying as useful fiction. Now, John's ideas were stakeholders, that really the corporation had to be concerned about vendors, had to be concerned about consumers, had to be concerned about producers, etc. And I think what Milton was saying and what I would say is, John, those are all the elements you have to deal with effectively in order to maximize profit for your shareholders. But it's been a very interesting way to look at it, because it does help people understand that most business people are not driven by money. Now, they're not giving it back, and I don't expect them to, and you wouldn't expect human nature. They'd give a lot of it back until they get older, and then they endow a tombstone on a college campus, which is the way Milton described how you, Matt, would get a new building created. But it's a very interesting perspective to take. Another lesson of this is, and that gets to the who pays, no, there is no one on the face of the earth, the tooth fairy, whatever, other than you that ever pays. What do you mean by that? Do businesses pay taxes? No. I'll just stick with that. What happens, and what happens if Whole Foods decides to raise their profits, raise their income? Do those profits go to the corporations? Do any of you think that's the case? I don't know of a corporation I know of that got those profits. It was the shareholders who got those profits, or the employees got a higher pay, or the vendors got paid more for their product, et cetera, et cetera. Any financial, I got to be clear here, any financial transaction ultimately ends up in your lap or my lap in some form. Now, it may be that it's only 2 cents in my lap, but it always comes back to the individual. That gets back, remember, to my granddaughter telling the nun, well, the government doesn't have any money. And when business taxes people, you get a very different outcome. Businesses do not pay, Milton Friedman now, businesses do not pay taxes. They collect taxes from their employees, stockholders, and customers on behalf of the government. And it's very easy to forget that particular aspect, among other things, because if you do an analysis, there's practically nothing in your life that isn't taxed. We've done a couple shows on that, and it is astonishing the degree to which anything you touch, anything you do, is taxed. And the trick of the politician is to come up with more inventive ways to do that every possible time, including legalizing gambling. Why? So they can get more money income. It's just another tax. Finally, I share with you the quote that I consider to be, in every sense, the foundational quote of Milton's ideas. The society that puts equality before freedom will end up with neither. The society that puts freedom before equality will end up with a great measure of both. Now, what is the thing about equality that's driving us? Equality is a big, big issue to deal with. Oh, social justice. How can so-and-so have more money and I'm struggling to just survive? That's not fair. Milton's answer to that was interesting. He said, yeah, life is not fair. But he then would say, so what can you do about it? What is fair? I've done my own thinking about it, and I have my own very simple definition of what's fair. And you're my victim, I've used you all the time. I would like to say that you've been great coming here to listen to me today. You agree?
Yes.
We've got a deal. That's fair. Or I want to buy your car for $50 and you say, hell no. That's not. In other words, any type of contractual agreement based on a voluntary thing, I did coerce you a little bit, based on a voluntary arrangement is fair. Now, it may not be wise. That's a different question. That whatever we agreed to, he sells me his car for $500, and a week later, somebody comes up and said, geez, I would have given you $750 for that. That's not unfair. It is an example of a transaction in which you weren't as careful as you should have been. And maybe I had knowledge you didn't have. Is that unfair? Not really. I have to use it. There's an opportunity cost to me getting any kind of knowledge, so that had to be factored in. But then I want to leave you with this question. If you don't accept that, if you say, oh, come on, Bob, gee, there got to be things that are unfair, we ought to do something about it. What are you going to do about it? How are you going to do it? Are we going to appoint Annabeth and Griffin to decide what's fair between any 2 students or 3 students on this college campus who have some kind of agreement and then one of them thinks the others have been treated unfair? Are we going to have Matt Waller become the judge of that? How are we going to do that? As soon as you do that, you move it into a third-party situation, and now what is that subject to? Oh, what if one of those 2 parties happens to invite Matt out every week or so to build influence with Matt because they know he's the judge, take him out to dinner? You immediately step into the world of corruption and the use of power, either physical power, the mafia, hey, you're going to agree, or boy, next week we're going to break your knees, or the person who has lots of wealth and who then buys the judge. The only way to avoid that is to have as many interactions among people to be at that handshake, voluntary agreement level. And that's why I think that quotation is so important to get people to accept it, because if you don't accept it, the end result is government beyond the point you would like to have it. Let me conclude with another poem. And again, back to choices. Dana Gioia is the poet, and I've met Dana. I'm very interested in his work. And again, this is about choices and about memories and about our lives and how well we've lived them or not lived them. We stood on the rented patio while the party went on inside. You knew the groom from college. I was a friend of the bride. We hugged the brownstone wall behind us to keep our dress clothes dry, and watched the sudden summer storm floodlit against the sky. The rain was like a waterfall, a brilliant beaded light, cool and silent as the stars. The storm hid from the night. To my surprise, you took my arm, a gesture you didn't explain. And we spoke in whispers as if we too might imitate the rain. Then suddenly the storm receded as swiftly as it had came. The doors behind us opened up. The hostess called your name. I watched you merge into the group, aloof and yet polite. We didn't speak another word except to say goodnight. Why does that evening's memory return with this night's storm, a party 20 years ago? Its disappointments warm. There are so many might-have-beens, what-ifs that won't stay buried. Other cities, other jobs, strangers we might have married. And memory insists on pining for places it never went, as if life would be happier just by being different. Summer Storm, Dana Gioia. I love it, what it conveys about our need to be totally aware of the life we're living. And this is what I see. I see so many of us, and Milton Friedman helped break me out of that. So many of us so engaged in the day-to-day activities, studying for our tests, etc., to just not rejoice in the wonder of existence and what's going on around us, and to benefit from that awareness, understanding that what is it that's going on around us. Milton Friedman helped me see the connectiveness and quality of life from the win-win of market exchanges in all areas of human endeavor. And when you open your eyes to the fact that there are billions and billions and billions of transactions going on in the world today among people just like us, trying to make the best out of the world, it brings you to a point of awareness, I think, that is very useful in understanding what kind of society you want to live in and to work the best you can to retain it. I hope with Milton's help, I've added a little bit to the richness of your life. Thank you. Now, happy to take questions. Oh, I do want to, oh, there's one thing. I left my note here. I must make, and some of you may wince when I first say this, but I'm a little hesitant to join, yes, I'm a little hesitant to join in the full embrace of George H.W. Bush. And it's for reasons that Milton Friedman is going to share with you. We have copies of this to pass out. And I won't read it to you, but Milton Friedman, at the introduction to Capitalism and Freedom, has a very interesting short kind of mini essay responding to JFK's inaugural comment about ask not what you can do for your country, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And I think if you read through this and apply it to what we've been hearing on the news coverage of service to mankind, etc., I think it will give you a very different perspective on government and the roles that and government's role in a free and civil society. Q&A. Any questions from anybody about anything? Yes, sir.
You mentioned having some sort of prior knowledge before doing a transaction isn't considered unfair. Is that right?
Sure.
So would you consider insider trading unfair, or should it be illegal?
One, I haven't studied that thoroughly. I've touched on it a bit in my thinking. I would basically say, I'm unclear about it, but I think I would lean toward certainly not criminalizing it. It becomes, for example, I was friends with a family that ran a cable TV company. Well, I'm going to go back and use John Mackey. John Mackey, Whole Foods. I just happened to be going to one of the Conscious Capitalism events, And I don't play the market. I'm a mutual fund, forget it and leave it. But for some reason or other, I became aware that Whole Foods had gone from like 80 to 9, or some really dramatic drop. And I don't know how long ago that was. And I went to this event, and John was talking, and it occurred to me, well, John's still head of Whole Foods. He's a pretty sharp guy, and the stores are still there. Now, was the fact that I knew John and I knew him, is that insider trading on the basis of insider information? I mean, I think it gets you into a sticky wicket in terms of making judgments. And I'd be inclined to say, there's other ways the markets can deal with that. You just among other things, you just have somebody like you start an app to out anybody who's doing that, and you try to correct it that way. Somebody here may have a better answer or have a different answer on the question of insider trading if you want to throw it out. But I have never felt it was a strong issue. I think there are far many other things, by the way, that influence the market bouncing up and down than insider trading. Although, obviously, anything we say, you can be sure somebody's going to figure out a way to play the system.
Right.
Yes, sir.
You might want to read some of the things by Henry Manne, M-A-N-N-E.
Yeah.
He's the former law professor who wrote about why insider trading should be legal. And basically it was about information, and there's information that circulates in the
Yeah.
marketplace, and some of the difficulties of that. And I think you'll have a lot of stuff you can run with that might be fascinating for you.
Thank you very much. I thought I was on the right track, but my memory is it's not all there. Exactly. Anyone else? Anything about the Friedmans? None? Oh my, I must have done either a very poor job or a very good job, and I'll choose, see, I get to choose, so I'll choose I did a very good job. But I do want to ask Annabeth and Griffin to give you a couple of comments about Capitol and their experience, and whether any of you should think about joining the activity next summer.
I don't know. I don't see any reason to not go there. If you're at all interested in economics or capitalism, like there's not a better place to sit with minds like Mr. Rob, Mr. West, Mr. David, if he'll be back. And I mean, there's nothing to do but learn. There's not a better place to do it than Capitol. I mean, it's beautiful out there. When you get to sit in a room that's 180 degrees of its glass, and you just get to look out at the mountains. And it's a really great place to learn for a week in the summer when you haven't been in school for a long time and pick your mind back up.
Annabeth?
Well, my experience with Capitol was really great. It was a great place for me to go, where I fundamentally agreed with most of the people there, but we disagreed on things that were a little bit deeper. So it was a good way to challenge me on things that I wasn't quite sure about, and caused me to ask questions that I hadn't thought before. So it's a great place to be. I think it's a box.
Yeah. And they didn't mention shooting the flintlock rifle. Any more questions? If not, thank you very much for coming. Really appreciate it.